It is extraordinary that Boris Johnson was the first world leader to have been given this privilege, to be invited to speak to Ukrainian MPs. I suppose that speaks to how the Ukrainian parliament sees the United Kingdom.
Tom, I don't think it is extraordinary because I don't think we were likely to see Joe Biden take the lead on this. The Germans, for obvious reasons, because their reliance on energy and oil from Russia. The same for other European leaders. So Boris saw the opportunity, stepped up and communicated this message yesterday, this speech, this talk in classic Boris Johnson style with his unique characteristics of humour. And I think this comes about because when he left Kyiv, 2-3 weeks ago, without the flak jacket, walking around alongside President Zelensky, his people at number 10 were thinking, now, how can we elaborate on this and build on this in time for the election? Not necessarily in a negative way and just trying to push Boris, because there's no question about it. He does support Zelensky. He does support the Ukrainian people. You can see that the way he speaks and the way he articulates his message. But at the same time, he also wants to be a thorn in the side to the Kremlin and, in particular, President Putin.
It's interesting looking at how Russian state media has been talking about the United Kingdom. There were suggestions from some people speaking on Russian state media that they could use some sort of nuclear weapon in the sea, perhaps a tidal wave unleashed on the United Kingdom. Probably not all that likely, but it does seem to be interesting that the United Kingdom in particular is the focal point for a lot of Russia's anger and ire. Does that mean we're doing something right?
Yes. Exactly. I think you just hit the nail right on the head. Well done. We are doing something right because there are two different aspects to this, or two different choices. You can either pretend it's not happening, stay out of it, shut the door, close the windows, and make sure that it doesn't affect you. And we know from history, we know from experience that eventually the bully boy will catch up with you once he's got rid of everyone else. So Boris is doing the right thing, and it's really a great thorn in the side to Putin. And he is the one. But from Russia's point of view, Russia sees England, Britain as such, as a tiny little island. It's now broken away from the EU, therefore there's no one to protect you, and I don't like the way that you're behaving. But as far as the nuclear threat goes, well, we have to remember that there is 9 countries in the world that have nuclear power. The two main ones, of course, are the US and the Russians, maybe China, because that's where a true nuclear war would take place. But I think we should most definitely play that down, because I don't think the Russian leader has any intention of thinking to myself, well, if I have a bad day tomorrow, I'm going to go back to my office, unlock the safe, push that button, and that's it. Well, it's not it, because basically what that means is, I mean, I'm talking in the 0.000 whatever case, that he goes completely nuts, and he would still need his chief of staff to endorse that. But if that was the case, you're talking about an international ballistic missile with a nuclear head on it, perhaps aimed at the United States. The US would hit back immediately. No Russian city would be. So we've got beyond ourselves. So right now, the focus is that the Russians have invaded an independent country, Ukraine, from 1991. That's when they gained their independence. And Boris and other Western leaders are saying, totally wrong. You need to leave the country. You're not going to do so. So we're giving the weapons in order for us to eventually, us being the Ukrainian side, to make an offensive against the Russians and eventually kick you guys out.
It's interesting looking at the Churchillian language that Boris Johnson used in his address. There are parallels that can be drawn with what happened in the 1930s, an emboldened and indeed aggressive expansionist German state then, one that had been hobbled by various financial crises and whatever. That is to some extent quite analogous to what has happened with Russia, a crippled economy, indeed an economy that's smaller than that of Spain. The United Kingdom spends more on our armed forces than Russia does on theirs. Are we doing now what the United Kingdom should have done in the 1930s, stopping that expansion before it entered into a worldwide conflict?
Wow. That's a long discussion on that, but briefly to touch on it, perhaps so, yes, and maybe it's right to say that we've learnt from history. We learnt from those dark days of Neville Chamberlain, who came back with that famous bit of paper, Peace in Our Time, in 1938, and of course it wasn't worth a paper written on. And Churchill and others in the House of Commons at the time knew that, and it was just a matter of time before things were going to develop. The same thing, by the way, can be said for the Russians today, because the Russians keep talking about the Nazis. If they don't like somebody, you're a Nazi. A Nazi being, presumably, from the days of Adolf Hitler. And yet, they seem to want to delete and get rid of that history that, for a time, 2 years actually, that they were allied with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis from 1939 to 1940. The only reason why Stalin tore up that agreement is because that Hitler decided to invade Russia after he left Britain alone.
Yes, no moral power to the Soviet Union, I suppose.